Welcome to the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I'm Virginia Comolli, Senior Fellow for Security and Development here at the Institute. Today's discussion on war in cities, new strategic dilemmas in an urban century is jointly organized by the IISS and by the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC. Both organizations have developed a strong focus on the challenges faced by cities, especially those in conflict situations. Late last year, the ICRC launched a new conference cycle on war in cities, and here at IISS, the Security and Development Program has formally inaugurated a new stream of research under the theme of security in the urban century. And right now, we are engaged in a project on post-conflict cities in Colombia, and jointly with the ICRC, we'll be hosting a conference at the end of November that looks at humanitarian implications of armed conflict in cities and related responses. The ICRC-IISS collaboration is also reflected in our, or rather Antonio's, contribution to the International Review of the Red Cross, a leading journal produced by the ICRC and edited by Vincent Bernard, who is here with us today, and whose latest issue is indeed focused on war in cities. And copies are on display on the table outside this room. There you'll also find the latest edition of the IISS Armed Conflict Survey, and I've been told that you can buy copies at a discounted price of £60 instead of 95 at the reception downstairs. But enough with this introduction. Let me just now turn to our panelists. I'm very pleased to introduce Avila Kilmurray, who's a visiting professor at the Transitional Justice Institute at Ulster University, and she also works as a consultant with the Social Change Initiative in Northern Ireland. Prior to that, she was the director of the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland for 20 years, and she was also one of the founding members of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition and also a member of its negotiating team during the peace talks in 96-98. She has worked extensively with local communities and their responses to the troubles. Another panelist is Vincent Bernard, who is the editor-in-chief of the International Review of the Red Cross, a leading journal by the ICRC, and he's also the head of the Law and Policy Forum, which leads ICRC engagement with global research and international humanitarian law. He has been posted to a number of countries during his time with ICRC, including to Dakar, Nairobi, and Jerusalem. Lastly but not least, my colleague Antonio Sampaio, Research Associate with the Security and Development Program here at IISS. He focuses on armed violence in cities, urban security policies, organized crimes, and among many other things. And he's also the author of one of the articles that appeared in the recent issue of the International Review of the Red Cross. So the structure of today's panel is as follows. First, we'll hear from Professor Kilmurray, who will reflect on past urban armed conflicts and draw on lessons learned from Belfast. Antonio will then reflect on the new dilemmas in urban environments. And finally, Vincent will discuss ICRC legal and operational positions and also interaction with other actors. This event will be on the record, and following the panelists' intervention, there will be ample time for question and answer. And now I'll turn to Professor Kilmurray for her own introductory remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, and hello everybody. What I pulled together in the short time I have is just some sort of thoughts of reflecting back since the start of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Unfortunately, I'm of an age to sort of remember them and be involved to an extent at community level, and also perhaps just some comments about some of the current challenges that we have. So looking back, first of all, I think that it's important that conflict analysis needs not only to look at security issues and military issues, but also the politics. Because it's the politics that actually frames the situation and frames the sort of the circumstances in which any military intervention happens. And in our situation, we were in 1969, whenever the army came in, coming out, well, still had a one-party government for 50 years, albeit democratically elected, but a majoritarian vote which was one party, and therefore framed a narrative that essentially excluded the minority. And not only did we have that at governmental level, we had that at administrative level in terms of the bureaucracy. And and indeed looking at the records of senior civil servants that were sent over from Westminster at the time, they really said that they knew nothing about the situation, and that's where they took their framing. Secondly, early military intervention copper fastens the political framing. So where we had a situation in the sort of the late 1969-70 period where actually the Catholic nationalist community were offering cups of tea to the British Army, very quickly you had three things over a 2-year period. You had the Falls curfew, was massive security coverage of a small Catholic area in Lower Falls for a three-night period, which completely alienated that community and rippled through the rest. You had internment without trial, which was based basically on faulty intelligence, because most of the people that were picked up had been active in the 1950s, and actually left the field free for the young Turks to come up, the Martin McGuinnesses, as was then, in terms of the 20-year-olds that took over the command of the Provisional IRA. And you then had Bloody Sunday, which effectively, again, reinforced a view that the army was acting on behalf of one political interest. Linked to that, and I think it's a situation in many divided societies, you had the increase in lack of confidence in any sense of the rule of law, which again meant that alternate pathways for change, such as constitutional struggle, such as sort of direct action, but non-violent direct action, were seen as being closed off. The other thing I think, just looking back, that's important and that actually still haunts us today, is very often the responses made are dealing with short-term crisis situations. Now that's understandable, but the reality is they have long-term implications. So the first barriers that were put between the single identity, increasingly single identity Protestant Unionist and Catholic nationalist areas became the peace walls. We still have 51 peace walls in Belfast along those same lines with a few additions. So something that was just an instrumental thing in terms of making it easier to police communities actually copper fastened a very segregated society. And similarly, the positioning and the location of security installations, looking at what way they're actually looking. Are they looking into one community rather than another? In our situation, they were. We also found over not just the 70s, but into the 80s and into the early 90s, that the political policy of demonization actually wins recruits for militant forces. Because if you treat communities that they are aligned with, in our case, largely the IRA, or on the other side, the UVF or the UDA, particularly young men actually self-identify with that, and it actually rallies support. So that we had what was called the herd principles in the late 80s, where funding, there was no support given for community initiatives that had any suggestion of links with republicanism, which in effect actually mobilized the community in support of those initiatives. And similarly, unrealistic official narratives do very little to actually build potential alternatives to violence. So we had a narrative that was introduced back in 1975, with the breakdown of the then ceasefire at the time by Roy Mason, which basically said, Northern Ireland's not at war, it's an aggravated crime wave, under this thing of Ulsterisation, normalisation, and criminalisation, which also incidentally led to the hunger strike. It wasn't a war, you couldn't have political prisoners, therefore you had the whole politics of the prison coming in. And lastly, in terms of a quick reflection, the emphasis on cities, and in our case we're talking about small cities, Belfast and Derry really, Londonderry are small cities, actually though can take away attention from towns. And I think actually sometimes, the oxygen of cities, people can forget that the smaller towns can, and in our situation, the smaller towns actually were much slower to become active supporters of some of the paramilitary groups. But when they're ignored and when the tensions develop in those smaller towns, they act as feed-through mechanisms for some of the paramilitary forces. So arguably, actually looking at doing a peace and conflict analysis of a situation, I always think that those smaller towns or market towns, hub towns, are actually very important in terms of trying to mobilize them in terms of peaceful strategies for change. The countryside is different. In our situation, again, the country areas, the rural areas, had a deep historical memory that went back not just sort of 10, 15 years, but went back generations and tracked land ownership in terms of a divided community. Looking at current challenges very quickly, peace negotiations, and as our chair said, I was part of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement negotiations, because they are actually so focused on trying to get peace with combatants, can squeeze the oxygen out of participative democracy. And that's what happened in the Northern Ireland situation. And you can end up, and so many conflict situations do as they're coming into a post-conflict situation, of almost like a politics that, okay, moves away from direct violence, but is command and control politics. Because actually there's sort of the approach that kept paramilitaries going in terms of successful transition into politics is still command and control. The pathways to peace must include not just the security and military dimensions, but also the social economic dimensions. And particularly, and again as one of our current challenges, particularly in terms of the self-perceived losers. Because the self-perceived losers don't see themselves as having any other pathway to go than either a reversion to violence or indeed reversion to gangsterism or drugs or whatever else. In our case, ironically, though it's probably counterintuitive, the self-perceived losers are the working class loyalist communities. Again, the issue around not just moving at community level, but moving the mindset of security forces is also important in that post-conflict period. Again, balancing the rule of law, and at the moment we have this Fresh Start initiative, which has sort of been held up by our political hiatus, but it's about the demobilisation of paramilitaries and trying to reintroduce respect for the rule of law. But then people on the ground see young people being used as informers, or see drug dealers being used as informers and not being arrested. So that actually creates or continues the sort of the question mark over the rule of law. The issue of physical division, and again I mentioned we still have the peace walls, makes initiatives, and we've had a number of successful initiatives, to try and stop rumours or manage rumours on both sides of those peace walls as really important, because rumours are the source of future violence. And again, what we successfully did was we actually, in most cases, used some of the ex-political prisoners through a mobile phone network, along with a number of local community activists, to act as debriefing mechanisms with each other in terms of potential sources of violence. The importance of building resilient communities to actually sort of carry the peace process forward. And I would argue, actually, looking at the English situation, we don't have it in Northern Ireland. I would have questions over the current Prevent strategy in terms of how much they're actually bringing inclusive communities forward, or how much they are increasing that sense of alienation. And actually, I'm just coming from a meeting of deputy mayors and compared that strategy with the New York Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, which is all about what they're doing in terms of inclusion for immigrant communities. And finally then, always to be conscious of not just explicit communication from the various parties, various combatants or various political parties, but also the implicit communication that's sent out. And one of the things that actually rooted the Good Friday Agreement negotiations was the ability of a couple of politicos from the Republic of Ireland to actually pick up on things that were appearing in Sinn Féin magazines or whatever else, in terms of sending out signals. There was a huge number of signals sent out in 1995 before the breakdown of the ceasefires that resulted in the bombing of Canary Wharf. If you were looking for them, you weren't surprised that ceasefire was temporarily going to break down. And the nuanced signal that I liked best in terms of the IRA really moving, although it was a bit tongue-in-cheek by about 1999, appeared in the walls of Derry saying, "Without arms, how can we tie our shoelaces?" Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vila. This was very useful to set the basis, I think, for a great discussion later on. You touched upon so many different issues. I, for once, I'd like really to stress the importance, for instance, as you mentioned, not to forget about the small towns and the small villages. In our own research related to urban insecurity, we realize there is lots of hype around the concept of megacities. for instance, but we should not forget about the challenges of mid-size and also small cities. And also very important, I think, to emphasize the issue of socioeconomic development and the fact that we have lots of these young people who in the post-conflict phase might feel that criminality is their only option. And these are some thoughts that we are going to take with us as we travel to Colombia on Sunday for some field research, and certainly that is very at the forefront of our thinking. So thank you for that. I will now turn to Antonio.
Thank you very much. So I think my role here, my aim is to really provide a very kind of broad perspective on how we're thinking about these issues of armed conflicts in cities, and more precisely how cities are affected by armed conflicts, because someone here once asked me as they were heading to a meeting with some strategic military thinkers, so is our cities facing more urban warfare? Are cities, facing different category of armed conflict? And my response was that really, I think that it's not really about cities facing more conflict that has caused us or motivated us to organize this event, but actually the increased vulnerability of cities to a range of conflict-related sources of instability. So, for instance, following the latest terrorist attack in London, the New York Times published a now infamous headline saying that London was reeling from the recent terrorist attacks, which caused sort of a Twitter storm, and many brought up the issue of Irish terrorism to say that actually London proved again and again to be a very resilient city against terrorism. I bring this case to illustrate how I think that, like many cities, London has been affected by a nearby conflict and insurgency in this case, during which it became not only a target but also an operational base for some Irish Republican terrorism. And obviously London is one of the richest and most globally connected cities in the world, and that has been a great asset in developing resilience, which is a word that Avila also mentioned, to terrorism. But what I really want to highlight is that many cities, and I think at least for a period of time London was part of this trend, often find themselves within a spectrum between war and peace. Their vocation for agglomeration tends to also serve as an invitation for conflict actors in search of the media attention, the illicit economies, and the young fighting age population that tend to concentrate in cities. Their size and social importance can even make them inevitable for non-state armed groups wanting to export illicit products, contact a global network of criminal actors, and launder money, for instance. So I would propose here to view some of these conflict actors, and I'm going to cite some of the examples, but some conflict actors have become some of the utmost cosmopolitans, citizens of the world whose greatest economic and political interests are symbolized by and explored in large agglomerations of people, products, commerce, and information. So whereas 20th century insurgencies and guerrilla wars tended to center around rural areas, the demographic pressures on urban systems have made cities not only permissible environments for armed activities, but also an attractive environment for that. They concentrate both local and transnational opportunities. So local ones would include extortion rackets, alliances with gangs and other criminal actors, corruption of political and economic elites, and territorial control of key peripheries or slums. This tends to be very clear in the post-conflict phases in many cities. And the transnational opportunities include money laundering through legal and illegal financial outlets, transnational smuggling networks, arms dealers, and global connections to other like-minded organizations. So this linkage between unmanaged urbanization and globalized conflict entrepreneurs has been visible in several regions affected by instability and conflict, sometimes referred to as fragile settings. Conflict in Syria has reignited instability in Beirut and Tripoli in Lebanon. The long-running insurgency in Afghanistan has stoked the fires of Karachi, and fighting rural areas of Somalia have deeply affected Mogadishu. Likewise, fighting in the rural areas of Colombia over the past few decades later produced rebel bases by FARC and ELN in the comunas, or the slums of Medellin. So these cosmopolitan rebels have expanded the range, have not necessarily caused the kind of urban warfare situations that sometimes are mentioned in the literature, but actually expanded the range of risks facing cities, which are often linked to armed conflicts, but don't necessarily take a classic format of warfare. The spectrum between urban warfare and peace contains many low-intensity but protracted and destabilizing situations. Obviously, conflict in cities is not new, as they are centers of power and the disagreements and fights associated with it. But the vulnerability, I would argue, of cities to armed conflicts and violence increases and becomes more consequential in a world of rapid and unmanaged urbanization. The increased complexity and density expands the range of risks related to armed activity. So the usefulness of considering these broad strategic trends and recognizing this spectrum of security risks is, of course, the formulation of public policies, potential responses. And as of now, and as I wrote in the International Review of the Red Cross, which you can collect later at the desk there, is that the go-to actors in international peace and security, such as the United Nations, the African Union, NATO, they are not thinking very hard about cities. For instance, how peace and security interventions there differ from the rural ones that tend to be viewed more prominently among the strategic studies community, which our institute here represents. For instance, the role of urbanism and architecture in helping in post-conflict integration and reconciliation between communities. How street layouts can have a role. I was in a conference 2 weeks ago in Nairobi, and the head of UN Habitat was giving a keynote speech, and he spent about an hour, he ran over his allotted time explaining how the chaotic layout of streets in Nairobi had a profound effect on the stability of the city. So these sorts of urban-specific questions and tools that become even more relevant in a world of rapid and unmanaged urbanization. And again, I don't think this is a purely academic question. The inability to account for urban-specific challenges can have very visible and damaging impacts on both security and development interventions. So many of you know better than I do that the mistakes made by the US-led coalition in Iraq following the invasion in 2003 have centered in cities and have become a source of dissatisfaction and resentment of local populations in terms of not failing to prevent looting and failing to provide the services and infrastructure that Iraqi urban dwellers demanded from the new authorities. Likewise, UN peacekeepers also famously confronted the challenge of gangs in the capital of Haiti, Port-au-Prince, and had to resort to the controversial use of force to reduce the threat to the rest of the city. Another reason why strategic and humanitarian actors are organizing events such as these is the concern over looming crisis in urban management in fragile settings, especially in Africa. It is currently the region one of the regions facing the fastest urban growth in absolute numbers. It currently has 400 million urban dwellers and is forecast to have about 1.2 billion in 2050. So that's a threefold increase in about 3 decades in a region already heavily affected by conflict and post-conflict situations. It is the region that has the largest number of UN peacekeeping forces by far. And South Asia is also a region that is facing the consequences of a nearby conflict, the insurgency in Afghanistan and instability in the Pakistani tribal areas, which has also severely affected Karachi, which is a city that Virginia visited for field research for our program a few weeks ago. And South Asia has been highlighted by the World Bank also for its unmanaged urbanization, which the World Bank called in a report messy urbanization, which is illustrated by around 130 million people that are living in slums. Just for illustration, that's more than the total population of Mexico. I will move now to Latin America, which is a topic that I have particularly focused on, which in many ways look like the exact opposite of this trend. It is a region where urban growth or urban populations have more or less stabilized. It's no longer growing at the super fast rates of the previous decades, but it's stabilized in a very high level. Around 80% of the people there live in cities. It is also, contrary to Africa and South Asia, a region that, with the exception of Colombia, has been free of politically motivated conflicts for a few decades. But I view Latin America as a useful case study and also a cautionary tale on post-conflict urbanization. Think of Central America, which faced several civil wars during the 70s, 80s, and even early 90s, and is now the civil wars that were centered on rural areas, but now these countries, especially El Salvador and Guatemala, face profoundly high levels of urban violence linked to criminal actors, gangs, centered on cities. Another element that I think makes Latin America a good case study is the fact that it has also seen, and Colombia is a good example, urban instability linked both to insurgencies and to criminality, and often a blur between these different categories within the spectrum between war and peace. So I was going to go into more details about Medellin, which is a city that was affected very profoundly by the conflict, even though the Colombian civil war, the Colombian insurgency was very rural-based. So Medellin saw the effects first of the conflict through waves of displaced populations, later moving into the slums, the comunas, as they are called there, and culminating in the causing guerrilla presence in the slums, and during the 90s and part of the 2000s, FARC, ELN, and many right-wing paramilitaries had bases in some of these slums in Medellin. And all of this culminated in a way in 2002 when the government conducted Operation Orion, which was a predominantly security and military operation, but that was followed up by a range of development operations, development interventions that are symbolized by the cable car connecting the slums to the broader urban economy and urban society. So Medellin is a good example of how these conflict trends can impact cities, not necessarily through high levels of armed conflict, but through kind of slow-burning sources of insecurity, and often expressed through criminal violence or a mixture between crime and conflict in cities. So let me just finish with a positive or sort of positive note. Cities have often been left on the outside looking into the discussions about national security and transnational threats. They're often tackled either by the COBRA meeting in the UK or by the United Nations Security Council. But I think that policymaking cities, and there's a growing awareness of that, can bring to the table a more pragmatic approach to problems, including security problems, that can be very useful. So I would encourage you to read the book by the late Benjamin Barber, who passed away a few months ago, If Mayors Rule the World, in which he argues that cities are the most networked and interconnected of political associations, and they are defined above all by collaboration and pragmatism, unlike national states, as we all know. So I think this sounds like a very solid base from which to build security relationships to tackle complex and transnational threats. So my bottom line is that I think urbanization is here to stay, is an unstoppable force in this century, and I greatly encourage this type of discussions, bringing people from a more developmental or peace-building approaches, people from strategic and humanitarian affairs, because I think the more we talk about it, the better the process of urbanization, especially in the global south, tends to be.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for taking us on this tour around the world, explaining how this phenomenon impacts so many different countries and cities, and in so many different ways with various levels of intensity. And now it's time for Vincent.
Thank you very much. Thank you for welcoming us today. It's a pleasure to be in London and discuss with you. Virginia presented the International Review of the Red Cross. We've been there since 1869 and reflecting the type of work that the IISS does, being present in the field, and then responding to the needs, studying the response, humanitarian response, and also suggesting developments in legal terms to improve the situation of victims. So that's what we've been trying to do in this issue of the journal, which you can still find outside, but it's also open access, and you can find it on the internet on the website of the ICRC, icrc.org. So we have tried to study the problem of war in cities and come with practical solutions, constructive ideas on how to address these problems in today's wars. We've decided also to continue the discussion and have a cycle of events. So this event falls into this cycle. And we have had a series of conferences in different parts of the world. I was in Moscow to discuss the legal challenges. That was a very interesting discussion in Russia. Most recently in St. Petersburg, we discussed the protection of cultural property, which is another issue in urban warfare. We will move to Kigali soon and then have a discussion about Africa and urbanization and potential conflicts, but they have had also their share of urban conflicts in recent years in Bangui, in Juba, and political violence. You mentioned Nairobi. And then we will move again to Geneva and view, which will reflect this multidisciplinary approach to the problems that we are trying to create. And I think it's very good we are on the same line on this issue, to bring different specialists, and that's what we've been trying to do here, including architecture. You've mentioned architecture with the peace walls. You mentioned the architecture of Nairobi. That's a very important dimension that we need to take into account. But for humanitarian actors, like for the military, it's rather new to adopt such a multidisciplinary approach. We thought we were professionals because we knew how to distribute food in rural areas, we knew how to ensure the logistics, and the military also had to review their practice in view of the current situation where we see more and more conflicts taking place in cities. As you said, it's not a new phenomenon. So if you go back in ancient times, we had mostly siege warfare, and cities were like nations sometimes. So you would attack a city, and the defense would take place on the city walls. But the population was affected because if the city would fall, the armies could loot and exterminate or enslave the population. Then we've seen in the 1930s and during the Second World War a new type of violence affecting cities with the first urban warfare types of combats. For instance, in Stalingrad, where you had massive military operations inside city, not around cities, but cities were becoming battlefields. And we had also the practice of aerial bombing, which developed tremendously during the 1920s, 30s, and culminated during the Second World War. And I think in London you still see some walls with the scars of the Second World War. So the idea of strategic bombing and had massive consequences on the civilian populations and affected cities. So today we see siege warfare is back, and we see urban warfare is back, and on a massive scale we had not seen since the Second World War probably. There were fightings in cities, in Beirut, we had the siege of Sarajevo, but what is happening mostly in the Middle East today appears as coming back to the Middle Age and to the Second World War. So that's why we decided to have this cycle and series of events, to reflect on the humanitarian needs posed by contemporary urban warfare and to try to bring solutions. And the solutions are quite simple, but are extremely difficult to implement. So actually it's a lot of common sense, and I will try to share this operational experience of the IISS and try to illustrate with a few points what we find in the field today and what could be solutions for these problems. And it's important because warfare in the future will take place in cities. It's probably something which will be with us for some time. So it's important that all actors involved start reflecting on the basis of the current crisis to prepare. And I think that was also the sense of your article in the review. Simply because the world is urbanizing. So urban warfare will take place over and again. And we see also a trend that non-state armed groups will operate more and more from cities. They will emerge from the cities, will be created in cities, and they will. So the first element is to look at the humanitarian consequences of these type of conflicts. And it's all over the news. So I looked at the internet this morning and I found a report by Human Rights Watch giving advice on how to conduct military operations in cities. I saw an article about the destruction of the Mosul library with hundreds of thousands of books which disappeared. I've seen many examples. In the recent weeks, we've seen attacks against civilians being evacuated from cities. We've seen attacks with chemical warfare or phosphorus ammunition. So all kind of different situations. So the first problem for the civilian population is obviously security, when they are directly under attack or when they live in an environment which is insecure. Second problem is the subsistence, is the question of access to food or other items which become rare, which disappear, and which can lead to a weakening of the population where epidemics can spread. Another problem is the lack of electricity or fuel supplies. I think in the reviews, one of the victims mentioned the fact that suddenly he is cold for the first time in Aleppo and discovers that winter is quite cold. And so we tend to forget that, but that's one of the first problems they face. Healthcare, we've tried to attract the world attention to the problem of attacks against medical facilities, and this is unfortunately a phenomenon which goes on. So medical doctors escape, flee from the cities, and people face a degradation of the health situation. And finally, something that you've touched upon in different ways also is the question of the future, the question of the peace, the question of the possibility for people to have a normal economic life, for kids to go to school, education. And as we are seeing conflicts which are protracted, which go on forever, we also have to take this into account in our planning of humanitarian operations in cities. So IISS has been working on that. We issued a report brought it for you. This is also accessible online, capturing our experience in working in cities, urban services during protracted armed conflict. And one dimension we want to highlight is this complexity of the urban environment, which where all the different parts act as a machine. We have a complex urban environment to provide services, and when one element is damaged, there is a series of cumulative effects or knock-on effects which lead to a degradation of the situation for the civilian population. So, and then at the end, you see the key messages that we would like to bring forward. So this animation film shows some of the consequences. You see also the most obvious destructions, but you see the displacement of population, and also the problems of which is not well reflected, the problem of health. We see cholera now in Yemen on a massive scale. This is a disease which is caused by, or which is made, which can spread because of poor hygiene and lack of health and sufficient medical care. So this is all interrelated. And this calls for a new way to approach our work in cities as humanitarian actors. So there were two messages here. First, we need to have a new type of humanitarian planning when it comes to operating in cities. We cannot just work with our traditional emergency mode, but we need to have, for instance, a new way of funding humanitarian response. We need also to develop new types of expertise within the humanitarian sector and a capacity to work in the multidisciplinary fashion. For instance, we discussed about architecture. We need to look at the cities as a complex machinery, and we cannot just limit ourselves to punctual remedial measures during the crisis. Also taking into account the time factor, which traditionally in humanitarian action was seen as very short, but it's no more the case. We see that conflicts go on, and in urban environments, this needs to be taken into account. We need to develop a new way to look at humanitarian action in cities. But IISS is not only providing assistance or delivering water and sanitation services. We are also calling the parties to respect international humanitarian law. And this has been particularly challenging in recent conflicts, where we've seen massive bombing of civilian areas. We've seen the use of prohibited weapons. We've seen direct attacks against civilian populations. And these are obviously prohibited acts. But beyond these clearly prohibited acts and war crimes, we see also that the urban environment poses a series of challenges for the military, even when respecting the law. Because we see that repeated attacks in urban environments will progressively degrade the environment and will create humanitarian problems. We see also that even when the parties want to respect the law, they face huge challenge, because urban environment is an environment where the civilians and the military objectives are closely mixed. So the IISS has been reflecting on these issues and organizing a series of expert meetings, recalling the law, but also trying to develop concrete measures to suggest to the parties to the conflicts to respect the law, to better abide to the law. And one particular issue, of course, is the use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas. These weapons are not prohibited as such, contrary to other weapons. I mentioned chemical weapons, which are clearly prohibited. But, you know, artillery shells or mortars, rockets are very common and are part of the military arsenal of every army. So how to use them in urban environments? So the IISS is asking states to avoid as much as possible to use them in densely populated areas. And sometimes going beyond what the law requires, but reflect in terms also of changing the military culture and practice. And I think that's something we need to discuss. I think we've seen also many militaries looking at the effectiveness of their operations and trying to reflect on combat in populated areas and trying to take better account of the civilian casualties. And this is also reflected in the journal. We have interesting articles coming from the military reflecting on their own practice. So there are many ways in which they can do that. For instance, in the calculation of the so-called collateral damage, the military are, under the law, under the obligation to assess the foreseeable impact of any attack and to weigh a balance between the military advantage they expect and the foreseeable damage to civilian properties and civilian infrastructures. So we ask them now that with our current knowledge, we don't look only at the immediate damage, but we try to take into account these cumulative impacts or these reverberating impacts of armed violence. So attacking a power plant may disable the hospital. And this now, with the knowledge of level of knowledge we have, needs to be taken into account in this proportionality calculation. So we are asking also the military to adopt the same multidisciplinary approach, to have engineers, to have medical doctors, to have architects working with them, and as far as possible, when planning of an attack is taking place, to take into account not only the immediate effect of their actions, of their attacks, but also all these various impacts that attacks in urban areas can have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think one clear trend here is that we need responses that are multidisciplinary, and we need to engage with a broad array of actors, from the more traditional and military to all the way to the architects and the urban planners and anyone else in the middle. Well, we now have about 10 minutes or so for questions and comments for the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and call on you. There will be a microphone coming to you. Before you ask your question, if you could also identify yourself. Well, first one, a gentleman on the first row.
Thank you. James Duval from Chatham House. I'd like to follow up this last question about how militaries operate in cities, because of course the main concern of a military is not the humanitarian situation, but winning. And one of the things that I was very struck by, Vincent, your remarks about the things that a military now has to take account, restrictions on explosive weapons. It seems to me that a result of this might not be the intended result. The result may be to say to Western militaries that the costs and the constraints to them of operating in a city in order to win their conflict are now very, very high. And so the solution to them is not to employ lawyers and architects, but actually to subcontract the military operation to local forces who are less constrained by these international regimes and by public opinion. So I wonder how you avoid that trap.
Thank you. Any other question? Yes, the gentleman on the second row.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Jason Sutton. I work at the Ministry of Defence. Just to add a little bit of colour to that, actually, I just recently came back from Iraq, where I was involved in targeting both lethal and non-lethal in Mosul. And actually, I would just slightly take issue with the we want to win and we're not interested in the humanitarian issue, because I think you'd probably be reassured with the lengths we tried to go to avoid civilian casualties in Mosul. But we were, as you've just described, actually, working through a proxy, largely, apart from the airborne targeting, through the Iraqi security forces, who were a very mixed organisation. Some were very good, others were appalling, actually, in their just indiscriminate use of rockets, mortars, etc. And I think the challenge we had was that although we took into account the civilian, the humanitarian issues, and we knew that if you'd lose the peace if you end up with another Aleppo, the problem was that we were so constrained. And ISIS was such an appalling enemy, so they were shooting children to stop people leaving, they were coercing people to stay, they were herding them into hospital, schools, mosques where they had their own command headquarters, etc. And they were also, in a very new type of suicide operation, they were rigging buildings with explosives and imprisoning large numbers of civilians inside them, and then using snipers on the roof to provoke a response, and then the whole lot would go up. Causing civilian casualties. So all these factors meant that we were in a dilemma. Do you go slowly to be so cautious, as we all instinctively felt we ought to be, but in doing so, do you prolong the conflict so much that you end up with the same effect? And either way, the population's alienated. So these are just real dilemmas. That's not really a question, but just sort of a comment, I suppose. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all, by the way, for the very interesting discussion.
Thank you. And the lady here on the first row.
Thank you. My name is Laura Boileau. I'm from Article 36 and I'm the coordinator of the International Network on Explosive Weapons, also known as INU. And as part of our work as the network of INU, we call on states and other actors to avoid the use of heavy explosive weapons in populated areas because of, like Vincent laid out, the harm to the civilian population and also the longer term harm on infrastructure as a result of bombing towns and cities. And I guess one observation in our work is that often the choice of weapon, in particular choice to use heavy explosive weapons in populated areas in towns or cities, is often an indicator of a conflict situation arising. But I was wondering what observations you have on the use of certain weapon systems in towns and cities and the implications of that, and also, maybe more interestingly, efforts to avoid the use of particular weapon systems because of the humanitarian harm that it causes when they're used in populated areas. Thanks.
Thank you. I think I will now come back to the panel, perhaps in reverse order. Vincent, would you like to start?
Thanks for your questions. I think they all resonate with this question of how the military can adapt to the new challenges posed in urban warfare. So first, your question, fighting by proxy. In international humanitarian law, states, when they become party to the Geneva Conventions, agree to respect the law, but also to ensure respect. And that's the Article 1 of the 4 Geneva Conventions. Normally, it goes without saying that when entering into a contract, you would respect it. But there is an extra clause which says ensuring respect. So they agree to respect and ensure respect. So that's the sense of our initiative, to talk to states who are engaged in multinational in operations abroad, which are supporting armed groups on the ground, so that they have an influence not only in equipping them, training them on how to conduct combat operations, but also on how to respect the law. So we are in a dialogue with several states on this particular Article 1 provision, trying to convince them to have influence on their allies fighting on the ground. So that would be to answer your point. At the same time, we also face an argument that you evoked, that actually, because there is symmetry, and I think you mentioned that, because the others are using so brutal tactics, then it creates an extra burden on the shoulders of professional armies. But we've seen this professionalization indeed. Professionalization comes from different ways. We've seen also an improvement in technologies. So we don't use carpet bombings anymore. We have more accurate weapons. This is a trend which has allowed to minimize civilian casualties. And so modern armed forces have also understood from Iraq or Afghanistan that it's also about securing the support of the population, that you could have very successful military operations, but if you lose politically, if you are seen as committing atrocities or crimes, or there are excessive civilian casualties, you would lose politically. And I think this is becoming now part of the professional ethos of modern armed forces, and that's, I think, a very positive element. But we haven't yet learned how to command that also. And I think that would be very interesting to publicize more instances of respect for the law, to show when the law is actually being respected. And I think armies also could learn to do that and show how they are taking care of these aspects. So that's one thing. We are trying at the moment to collect cases of respect for the law. Because it's very interesting, when you study law, you study only crimes. You never study how to implement it. So it's quite interesting. Now we are engaged in this collection of stories where the law has been respected. Now, going back to your question of use of explosives in densely populated areas, as I said, we are of the opinion that they should be avoided in populated. These type of weapons should be avoided. So the law has a series of provisions which can be helpful to try to assess the legality of the use of these weapons. The calculation of proportionality I mentioned, the importance of distinguishing between civilian population and military objectives. But all this is a matter of complex evaluation, assessment of the ground. Our opinion is that as far as possible, they should be avoided in populated areas.
I was actually presenting these issues at a seminar in a university, University of Oxford, and there was a visiting fellow or PhD student that was from a military agency or member of the armed forces somewhere, and he was saying that actually kind of precision bombs have been changing quite a lot the calculation of use of explosives in cities, and his view was that that was actually helping armed forces to use explosive devices in cities while achieving both aims, to reduce or minimize civilian casualties and achieve operational objectives. Obviously, but I would argue that there is a broader issue that could, if discussed properly with in a multidimensional, multidisciplinary perspective, further reduce the propensity to use explosive weapons or even subcontract proxies in cities, which is what the objectives are. So I think again the case study of Iraq is scary and fascinating, in which in that it became quite clear that cities and their stability after major conflict are quite important. So it is in the interest of armed forces, not only for the visibility of their operations or their PR, but also for the long-term stability efforts in cities. So I think in many circumstances, you see the strategic literature shifting from the more operational side of military operations in urban environments, MOUT, to stabilization, peacekeeping, peace building. So, for instance, General Charles Krulak in the US proposed the 3-block war. So you conduct combat in one block, you conduct peacekeeping in another, and you conduct humanitarian relief in another. So there is a range of objectives in cities, and I think it links to the debate about the utility of force in our current world. That's something that the armed forces, the strategic literature, are also struggling with. That especially after Iraq and Afghanistan, I think there is a humbling of the armed forces in realizing that there are great limitations on the utility of force, and that sometimes the best that you can hope and work for is stability alongside long-term development. And I think the more we debate these issues on a multidisciplinary setting with armed forces, law enforcement, development and humanitarian actors, the more this conclusion, this evidence base will sink in terms of the importance for the national interests or the foreign policy interests of Western states or international peace and security actors like the African Union, the UN, in securing not only victories in cities, but more importantly, stability and development, so a more gradual and long-term aim.
I think my only comment would be in terms of that sort of concept of the 3-block war is that it would need to be thought through very carefully in terms of analysis and integrated, because otherwise the danger is that it just becomes hypocritical because one aspect is undermined by the security aspect of another. And the problem with the use of proxies, I think, is that it can come back to haunt you.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have reached the end of our allotted time. I I thought this was a very stimulating debate. I would like to thank the panelists and also thank you for your contribution. We will be doing more work on the issue of urban security and the challenges of cities, both IISS independently and with our colleagues and friends at the ICRC. So please keep an eye on our website for future events and research. But before we go, I'd like to invite you to join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you.